Betrayed woman meets billionaire who fights for her. The conference room fell silent as Jessica Brooks placed her final document on the mahogany table. Her dark skin glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her perfectly tailored navy suit couldn't hide the tension radiating from her 5'8" frame. She'd spent 2 years planning this moment, 2 years rebuilding herself from the ashes of betrayal, and now Malik Brown was about to face the consequences of stealing her life's work. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd clawed her way back from nothing, "I'm here to present an acquisition offer that will benefit everyone in this room." Her eyes found Malik's across the table, and for just a moment, she allowed herself to savor the confusion flickering across his handsome features. He had no idea what was coming. But there was someone else in that room who made her pulse quicken in ways she hadn't expected. Christopher Wilson sat at the head of the table, his steel-gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin warm. At 44, he commanded attention without trying, broad shoulders filling out his custom suit, dark hair showing distinguished touches of silver at the temples. He was the kind of man who made smart women forget their carefully laid plans. Jessica forced herself to focus. This wasn't about attraction. This was about justice. A mess. "Brooks," Malik's voice carried that same smooth charm that had once made her believe in forever, "I'm curious about your interest in our little consulting firm. Last I heard, you were taking some time to reassess your career goals." The patronizing tone hit exactly as he'd intended. Jessica's hands clenched briefly before she smoothed them against her skirt. She'd practiced this moment 1,000 times, but hearing his voice again, the same voice that had whispered promises while he stole her client list, made her stomach clench with remembered pain. "My career goals are quite clear, actually," she replied, her tone professional despite the fire building in her chest. "I'm here because Brooks Strategic Consulting has identified significant value in acquiring certain assets from your operation." She watched Malik's confident smile falter slightly. "Good. Let him wonder." Christopher leaned forward, his presence suddenly filling the space between them. "Ms. Brooks, perhaps you could elaborate on exactly which assets have caught your attention?" His voice was deep, measured, with just a hint of curiosity that made her wonder if he already knew more than he was letting on. Their eyes met, and Jessica felt something electric pass between them. He wasn't just making small talk, he was genuinely interested in her answer. When was the last time a man had looked at her and seen her mind first? "I'm particularly interested in the proprietary client management system that's been so instrumental in your recent success," she said, never breaking eye contact with Christopher even as her words were aimed at Malik. "The one that uses predictive analytics to identify client pain points before they become problems." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Malik's face went pale, and Jessica felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, he understood. "That system was developed in-house," Malik said quickly, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Jessica interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "I'm stating facts. That system, every algorithm, every predictive model, every line of code, was developed by me during our partnership. Before you decided that partnership meant taking credit for my work while I was handling the Henderson merger." Harrison Gray, Christopher's business associate, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Christopher's gaze sharpened, and Jessica could practically see the wheels turning in his mind. "This is unexpected," he said slowly. "Mr. Brown, perhaps you'd like to address these allegations?" "They're not allegations," Jessica said, pulling out a thick folder. "They're documented facts. I have every email, every draft, every timestamp that shows the development of that system. I also have the intellectual property filing that I submitted 6 months before Malik's company claimed ownership." She watched Malik's face crumble as the reality of her preparation sank in. 2 years of planning, 2 years of gathering evidence, 2 years of rebuilding her life around this moment of vindication. But it was Christopher's reaction that surprised her. Instead of the calculating business interest she'd expected, she saw something that looked almost like respect. Admiration. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "this is quite an impressive presentation. But I have to ask, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica had expected anger, denial, maybe even threats. She hadn't expected this calm, almost gentle inquiry that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade. "I want what's mine," she said simply. "My work, my reputation, my future. Everything he took from me. And you think acquisition is the answer?" Christopher's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. "Rather than litigation?" "Litigation takes years," Jessica replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "Acquisition takes months. And it sends a much clearer message about the value of intellectual property." Christopher nodded slowly, and Jessica caught a hint of something that might have been approval in his expression. "You've thought this through." "I've had 2 years to think it through." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw understanding dawn in Christopher's eyes. He wasn't just seeing a business deal, he was seeing a woman who'd been hurt and was fighting back with everything she had. 2 years, he repeated softly. "That's a long time to carry that kind of motivation." Their eyes locked again, and Jessica felt something shift in the room. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility, with an understanding that went beyond business deals and revenge plans. Malik cleared his throat loudly, breaking the spell. "This is ridiculous. Chris, you can't seriously be considering." "I'm considering a lot of things," Christopher said, his voice cutting through Malik's protests. "Ms. Brooks, I think we need to discuss this further. Perhaps we could continue this conversation over dinner?" Jessica's pulse jumped. Was he asking her out, or was this just business? The way he was looking at her made it impossible to tell, and that uncertainty sent a thrill through her that she hadn't felt in years. "I think that would be productive," she managed, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Excellent. My assistant will be in touch with the details." Christopher stood, his commanding presence filling the room. "Gentlemen, I think we're done here for today." As the meeting dispersed, Jessica felt a mix of triumph and confusion swirling in her chest. She'd come here for revenge, but she was leaving with something much more complicated, the promise of dinner with a man who looked at her like she was worth understanding. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. Jessica walked out of that conference room with her head held high, but her mind was spinning. She'd planned every detail of her revenge, but she hadn't planned for Christopher Wilson. She hadn't planned for the way he looked at her, not as a threat or an opportunity, but as a woman worth knowing. And that terrified her more than Malik ever had. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Jessica caught her reflection in the polished steel. She looked composed, professional, successful. But underneath that carefully constructed exterior, something was shifting. Something that felt dangerous and exciting and completely beyond her control. She'd spent 2 years building walls around her heart, walls designed to keep out anything that might hurt her again. But one look from Christopher Wilson, and those walls were starting to crack. The elevator descended, carrying her away from the confrontation she'd dreamed about for so long. But instead of feeling the satisfaction she'd expected, she felt something else entirely: anticipation. Tomorrow night, she'd be sitting across from Christopher at dinner, and she had no idea what that might lead to. For a woman who'd built her life on certainty and control, the unknown felt like stepping off a cliff. But as the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened to reveal the bustling city beyond, Jessica found herself looking forward to the fall. Chapter 2. Jessica's heels clicked against the marble floor of her downtown office building as she made her way to the elevator. The familiar sound usually brought her comfort, the rhythm of success, of a woman who'd rebuilt herself from nothing. But today, it felt different. Today, every step seemed to echo with the memory of Christopher Wilson's steel-gray eyes studying her across that conference table. She'd called Dorothy Adams the moment she'd left the meeting, needing her best friend's no-nonsense perspective to ground her spinning thoughts. Dorothy had been there through everything, the betrayal, the bankruptcy, the sleepless nights spent rebuilding Brooks Strategic Consulting from the ashes of her dreams. "You did what?" Dorothy's voice carried clearly through the phone as Jessica unlocked her office door. At 52, Dorothy had been practicing law for nearly 3 decades, and very little surprised her anymore. But Jessica's impromptu dinner invitation had apparently done the trick. "I accepted a dinner invitation," Jessica repeated, sinking into her desk chair. The view from her 20th floor office showed the city sprawling below, all gleaming glass and endless possibility. She'd fought for this view, this office, this second chance at the life Malik had stolen from her. From Christopher Wilson. Dorothy's tone was flat, the way it got when she was processing information that didn't fit her expectations. The Christopher Wilson. The man who could buy and sell half the companies in this city without blinking. The same one. Jessica kicked off her heels and tucked her feet under her in the chair. "Dorothy, you should have seen Malik's face when I presented the evidence. He went white as a sheet." "Forget Malik for a minute," Dorothy said, and Jessica could hear the familiar sound of her friend's pen tapping against her desk, the rhythm she used when she was thinking hard. "Let's talk about why you're having dinner with a man who could destroy your little revenge plan with a single phone call." Jessica's stomach clenched. She'd been so focused on the electric tension between her and Christopher that she hadn't fully considered the implications. "You think he's going to shut me down?" "I think," Dorothy said carefully, "that Christopher Wilson doesn't do anything without a reason. And I think you need to figure out what that reason is before you sit down to dinner with him." The truth of Dorothy's words settled over Jessica like a cold blanket. She'd been so thrown by her unexpected attraction to Christopher that she'd forgotten the most important lesson Malik had taught her: never trust a man's motives, especially when he's being charming. "You're right," Jessica said, but even as she said it, she couldn't shake the memory of how Christopher had looked at her. Not like a business opportunity or a threat, but like a woman worth understanding. "I need to be careful." "Careful is putting it mildly," Dorothy muttered. "Jess, honey, I've watched you rebuild yourself from nothing. You're stronger than you've ever been, smarter than you've ever been. Don't let some attractive billionaire make you forget that." After Dorothy hung up, Jessica sat in her quiet office, watching the sun set over the city. She'd thought the hard part was over, confronting Malik, reclaiming her work, proving her worth. But sitting here now, with Christopher's dinner invitation burning in her mind like a brand, she realized she might be facing an entirely different kind of challenge. Meanwhile, across town in his glass-walled penthouse office, Christopher Wilson was having his own moment of reflection. Harrison Gray sat across from him, nursing a glass of whiskey and wearing the expression of a man who'd seen his best friend make questionable decisions before. "So let me get this straight," Harrison said, his voice carrying the slight southern drawl that became more pronounced when he was concerned. "You're having dinner with a woman who just accused your potential business partner of intellectual property theft." "Alleged business partner," Christopher corrected, swirling his own whiskey. "And yes, that's exactly what I'm doing." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Christopher with the kind of attention that came from 15 years of friendship and business partnership. "This wouldn't have anything to do with the way you couldn't take your eyes off her during that meeting, would it?" Christopher's jaw tightened. Harrison knew him too well. "She's brilliant, Harrison. Did you see how she presented that evidence? She didn't just document theft, she documented every communication, every timestamp, every revision. That level of thoroughness is impressive. Impressive, Harrison repeated. Right. And I'm sure her intelligence is the only thing you found impressive about her. Christopher shot him a look that would have made a lesser man back down. Harrison just grinned and took another sip of his whiskey. Look, Chris, I'm not saying she's not beautiful, because she is. And I'm not saying she's not smart, because clearly she is. But you've got to ask yourself what she really wants from you. Maybe she doesn't want anything from me, Christopher said, but even as he said it, he knew how naive it sounded. In his world, everyone wanted something. Money, connections, opportunities, there was always an angle. Come on, man, Harrison said gently. You're worth more than most small countries. Beautiful, brilliant women don't just have dinner with you because they enjoy your sparkling personality. Christopher stared out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. Harrison was right, of course. Logic dictated that Jessica Brooks had an agenda. But when she'd looked at him across that conference table, when he'd seen the fire in her dark eyes and the steel in her spine, logic had taken a backseat to something much more primitive. He'd been attracted to her intelligence first, the way she'd presented her case with surgical precision, the way she'd faced down her betrayer with quiet dignity. But it was more than that. It was the glimpse of pain he'd seen beneath her professional mask, the vulnerability she'd tried so hard to hide. Christopher had spent his adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. But Jessica Brooks looked like a woman who'd rather fight her own battles than ask for help. That kind of strength was intoxicating. What if you're wrong? He asked Harrison. What if she's exactly what she appears to be? Then you'll have a lovely dinner with a brilliant, beautiful woman, Harrison replied. But if I'm right, you could find yourself in the middle of a very expensive mess. Christopher nodded, but his mind was already made up. Tomorrow night, he'd find out which one of them was right. The next evening, Jessica stood in front of her bedroom mirror, second-guessing her choice of outfit for the third time. She'd settled on a black dress that hugged her curves without being too revealing, paired with heels that gave her enough height to look Christopher in the eye. Professional but feminine, confident but not aggressive. She'd spent the day researching everything she could find about Christopher Wilson. 44 years old, never married, no children. He'd built his fortune through a series of innovative financial software companies, each one more successful than the last. He was known for his fair treatment of employees and his strategic philanthropy. On paper, he was everything Malik pretended to be. But Jessica had learned not to trust paper. She'd learned not to trust charm or intelligence or even apparent kindness. She'd learned to trust actions, and Christopher's actions were still a mystery. The restaurant he'd chosen was elegant but not showy, the kind of place where serious business was conducted over exceptional food. Jessica arrived 5 minutes early, a habit she'd developed in her consulting days. Punctuality was respect, and respect was something she'd learned to demand. Christopher was already there, standing as she was led to their table. He looked different outside the conference room, less intimidating, more approachable. His charcoal suit fit him perfectly, and when he smiled, she caught a glimpse of the man beneath the billionaire facade. "Ms. Brooks," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." "Jessica," she corrected, taking his hand. The contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm that she tried to ignore. "And thank you for the invitation." He held her chair as she sat, a gesture that was becoming increasingly rare in her world. The simple courtesy made her hyper-aware of his presence behind her, the subtle scent of his cologne, the warmth radiating from his body. "I have to admit," he said, settling into his own chair, "I'm curious about you, Jessica Brooks." "Curious how?" she asked, grateful for the steadiness in her voice. "Curious about what drives a woman to spend 2 years planning the perfect revenge," he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, only genuine interest. "That level of dedication is remarkable." Jessica felt her defenses rise. "You think it's excessive?" I think it's understandable, he said, and the simple validation caught her off guard. Someone stole something precious from you. Most people would have moved on, cut their losses. But you didn't. You fought back. Most people don't have a choice, Jessica replied. When someone takes everything from you, you either fight or you disappear. Christopher nodded slowly. And disappearing wasn't an option for you. No, she said simply. It wasn't. They ordered their meals, and the conversation flowed more easily than Jessica had expected. Christopher was an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions about her work, her rebuilding process, her plans for the future. He didn't pry about the details of her relationship with Malik, but she could see the questions in his eyes. Can I ask you something? She said as their main courses arrived. Of course. Why dinner? Why not just handle this through lawyers and board meetings? Christopher was quiet for a moment, cutting his steak with precise movements. Because I wanted to understand you, he said finally. Business is easy, it's all numbers and contracts and calculated risks. But people are complicated. And I had a feeling you were more complicated than most. The honesty in his voice made Jessica's chest tighten. When was the last time someone had been interested in understanding her, rather than using her? What have you concluded? She asked. That I was right, he said, meeting her eyes. You are more complicated than most. The look that passed between them was electric, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Jessica felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack, and the sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself from nothing? Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who teach us our true strength. Share your story in the comments below. This community is here to support each other through every chapter of our journeys. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of conversation and stolen glances. Christopher talked about his work, his travels, his hopes for the future. Jessica found herself sharing more than she'd intended, her struggles after Malik's betrayal, her determination to prove herself, her dreams of building something that couldn't be taken away. By the time they finished dessert, Jessica felt like she'd been through an emotional marathon. She'd expected a business dinner with strategic maneuvering and careful revelations. Instead, she'd found herself in the company of a man who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. I should go, she said as the waiter cleared their plates. Early morning tomorrow. Of course, Christopher said, but she caught a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. I'll walk you to your car. The night air was cool against her skin as they stepped outside the restaurant. Jessica's car was parked just down the street, but the walk felt both too long and too short. She was hyper-aware of Christopher beside her, matching his longer stride to hers, his presence both comforting and unsettling. Thank you for dinner, she said when they reached her car. It was illuminating. The pleasure was mine, he said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. Jessica, about your situation with Malik. Her stomach clenched. Here it comes, she thought. The real reason for dinner. The condition, the catch, the price of his interest. I want you to know, he continued, that I'll be conducting my own investigation into his claims of intellectual property ownership. If what you've presented is accurate. It is accurate, Jessica said quickly. Then he'll face the consequences, Christopher finished. I don't do business with thieves. The simple statement hit Jessica like a physical blow. Not because it was harsh, but because it was fair. Because it was the kind of justice she'd been fighting for, delivered without fanfare or dramatics. Why? She asked. Why would you do that? Christopher stepped closer, and Jessica's breath caught. In the dim light from the street lamps, his eyes looked almost black. Because some things are worth fighting for, he said quietly. And some people are worth protecting. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility. Jessica felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by the warmth in his voice and the strength in his presence. For a moment, she forgot about revenge and betrayal and carefully laid plans. For a moment, she was just a woman standing close to a man who made her feel things she'd thought were dead and buried. Then reality crashed back, and she stepped away. "I should go," she repeated, her voice slightly breathless. "Of course," Christopher said, but his eyes never left hers. "Drive safely, Jessica." She got into her car and drove away, but she could feel his gaze following her until she turned the corner. Only when she was safely in her apartment did she allow herself to process what had happened. She'd gone to dinner expecting to be seduced by his wealth or manipulated by his charm. Instead, she'd found herself drawn to his intelligence, his fairness, his genuine interest in her as a person. It was more dangerous than any manipulation could have been. Because for the first time in 2 years, Jessica Brooks was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, not all men were like Malik Brown. And that terrified her more than anything else could have. Chapter 3. 3 days after their dinner, Jessica was still trying to convince herself that the flutter in her stomach every time her phone buzzed wasn't hope that Christopher might be calling. She'd thrown herself into work with renewed intensity, using the familiar rhythm of client meetings and strategic planning to push thoughts of steel gray eyes and gentle questions from her mind. It wasn't working. She was reviewing quarterly projections when her assistant knocked on her door. "Ms. Brooks? There's a delivery for you." Jessica looked up from her computer screen, surprised. She wasn't expecting anything. "What kind of delivery?" "Flowers," her assistant said with a knowing smile. "Very expensive-looking flowers." Jessica's pulse quickened despite her attempts to remain professional. She accepted the arrangement, a stunning display of white orchids and deep purple roses that must have cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, and found the card nestled among the blooms. "Thank you for an enlightening evening. I hope we can do it again soon." Christopher, the handwriting was bold, confident, unmistakably masculine. Jessica stared at the note for a long moment, her heart doing things that had nothing to do with professional courtesy. When was the last time someone had sent her flowers? When was the last time someone had wanted to see her again without an agenda? She was still holding the card when Dorothy burst into her office without knocking, a privilege of 20-year friendships and legal partnerships. "Okay, spill," Dorothy said, settling into the chair across from Jessica's desk. "And don't tell me those flowers are from a grateful client, because I know grateful client flowers when I see them, and those are definitely not grateful client flowers." Jessica sank back into her chair, suddenly feeling exhausted. "They're from Christopher." "Christopher Wilson," Dorothy repeated slowly. "The man you had dinner with 3 nights ago. The man you swore you were only meeting for business purposes." "I was only meeting him for business purposes," Jessica protested weakly. Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "Honey, no man sends a woman $300 worth of orchids for business purposes." "What happened at that dinner?" Jessica found herself telling Dorothy everything, the easy conversation, the genuine interest in her thoughts and dreams, the way Christopher had looked at her like she was worth understanding. She told her about the investigation he'd promised to conduct, the justice he'd offered to deliver without being asked. "And you believed him?" Dorothy asked when Jessica finished. "I wanted to," Jessica admitted. "God, Dorothy, I wanted to so badly. But what if I'm just being naive again? What if he's just another Malik with better packaging?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, studying Jessica with the kind of attention she usually reserved for complex legal briefs. "You know what I think," she said finally. "What?" "I think you're terrified." Jessica started to protest, but Dorothy held up a hand to stop her. "Not of him," Dorothy continued. "Of yourself. Of the possibility that you might actually be falling for someone who could be good for you. That's scarier than being fooled by another snake like Malik, because at least with Malik, you knew what you were dealing with." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow because they were true. She was terrified, not of Christopher's potential betrayal, but of her own growing feelings. She'd spent 2 years building walls around her heart, and Christopher was dismantling them with nothing more than genuine interest and honest conversation. "What if I'm wrong about him?" Jessica asked quietly. "Then you'll deal with it," Dorothy said simply. "But what if you're right? What if he's exactly what he appears to be?" "Then I don't know what to do with that," Jessica admitted. Dorothy leaned forward, her expression serious. "Jess, you spent 2 years proving that you could rebuild yourself from nothing. You've shown that you're stronger than you ever thought possible. Don't let fear of being hurt again rob you of the chance to be happy." After Dorothy left, Jessica sat in her office, staring at the flowers and thinking about courage. She'd been brave enough to confront Malik, brave enough to rebuild her business, brave enough to demand justice. But the idea of opening her heart to someone new felt like the most dangerous thing she'd ever considered. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart jumped when she saw Christopher's name on the screen. "I hope you liked the flowers. Are you free for lunch today? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Jessica stared at the message for a full minute before typing back, "I'm free. Where would you like to meet?" His response came quickly, "My office. I'll have lunch brought in." "Is noon good?" "Perfect. See you then." Jessica spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on work and failing spectacularly. By the time she arrived at Christopher's office building, her nerves were stretched taut as piano wire. The executive floor was a study in understated luxury, rich wood paneling, soft lighting, and artwork that belonged in museums. Christopher's assistant led her through a maze of offices to a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Christopher stood as she entered, and Jessica felt that familiar flutter in her stomach at the sight of him. He'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, giving him a more relaxed appearance that somehow made him even more attractive. "Jessica," he said, crossing the room to greet her. "Thank you for coming. I hope you're hungry. I ordered from that Italian place on 5th Street. "Starving," she lied, though food was the last thing on her mind. The office smelled like him, clean, masculine, with hints of cedar and something indefinably warm. They settled at a small table near the windows, and for a few minutes, they made polite conversation about the weather and the view. But Jessica could sense an undercurrent of tension, as if Christopher was building up to something important. "Jessica," he said finally, setting down his fork. "I asked you here because I wanted to give you an update on the investigation into Malik's intellectual property claims." Jessica's stomach clenched. "Already? It's only been 3 days. I have good people," Christopher said simply. "And your documentation made their job easier. You were very thorough. What did they find?" Jessica asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Christopher leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Everything you claimed checks out. The timestamps, the emails, the development records, it's all there. Malik Brown stole your work, Jessica. There's no question about it." Relief flooded through Jessica so powerfully that she felt dizzy. After 2 years of carrying the weight of injustice, of wondering if she was crazy or vindictive or wrong, she finally had official validation. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, I withdraw from any business relationship with Mr. Brown," Christopher said. "And I make sure that certain key people in our industry know exactly what kind of businessman he is." Jessica felt tears prick the back of her eyes. "Why are you doing this for me?" Christopher was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I care about what happens to you." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either connect them or burn beneath their feet. Jessica felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she processed his words. "Christopher," she started, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know this complicates things," he said. "I know you came to me for business reasons, and I've just made it personal. But I couldn't sit by and watch someone get away with hurting you." Jessica stared at him, this powerful man who could have ignored her claims or dismissed her pain, but instead had chosen to fight for her. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous, that it left her speechless. "You don't even know me," she managed finally. "I know enough," Christopher said, his voice soft but certain. "I know you're brilliant and brave and beautiful. I know you fight for what's right, even when the odds are against you. I know you rebuild yourself from ashes and come back stronger than before." Each word hit Jessica like a caress, and she felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. This was dangerous territory, the kind of emotional vulnerability that had destroyed her before. "I should go," she said, starting to rise from her chair. "Should you?" Christopher asked, and something in his tone made her stop. "Or do you want to go?" The question forced Jessica to confront the truth she'd been avoiding. She didn't want to go. She wanted to stay in this warm office with this man who saw her as more than a business opportunity or a conquest. She wanted to bask in the glow of being truly seen and appreciated. But wanting something and being brave enough to reach for it were two different things. "I don't know," she admitted, sinking back into her chair. Christopher leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Can I tell you something, Jessica?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. 3 days ago, when you walked into that conference room, you took my breath away. Not just because you're beautiful, though you are. But because of the fire in your eyes, the steel in your spine, the way you faced down your betrayer with such dignity and strength. Jessica felt heat rise in her cheeks. No one had ever described her that way before. "I've spent most of my adult life surrounded by people who want something from me," Christopher continued. "Money, connections, opportunities. But you looked like a woman who'd rather fight her own battles than ask for help. That kind of strength is intoxicating." "I'm not as strong as you think," Jessica whispered. "You're stronger than you know," Christopher replied. "But even strong people deserve support sometimes." The gentle words broke something loose in Jessica's chest, and she felt tears threaten again. When was the last time someone had offered her support without expecting something in return? "Christopher," she said, her voice barely audible, "I'm scared." "Of me?" "Of this," she gestured between them. "Of caring about someone again. Of being wrong about you the way I was wrong about Malik." Christopher reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, but she didn't pull away. "I can't promise I won't hurt you," he said quietly. "No one can promise that. But I can promise that I'll never deliberately deceive you, never steal from you, never make you question your own worth." Jessica looked down at their joined hands, his larger, darker from sun exposure, covering hers completely. The simple contact felt like an anchor in a storm she hadn't realized she was drowning in. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to trust someone again." "We don't have to figure it all out today," Christopher said. "We can take it slow. See where it leads." Jessica looked up to find him watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. This was the moment of choice. She could retreat behind her walls and keep herself safe, or she could take the terrifying leap of faith into the unknown. "Okay," she said finally, the word barely a whisper. Christopher's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Okay?" "Okay," she repeated, stronger this time. "But slow. Really slow. As slow as you need," he promised. They finished lunch with lighter conversation, but the air between them hummed with new possibility. When Jessica finally left his office, she felt like she was walking on unsteady ground, not because she was afraid of falling, but because she was afraid of how much she wanted to soar. That evening, Jessica sat in her apartment with a glass of wine, staring at the flowers Christopher had sent. Dorothy was right, she was terrified. But for the first time in 2 years, her fear was mixed with something else, hope. Her phone buzzed with another text from Christopher, "Thank you for lunch. Sweet dreams, Jessica." She held the phone for a long moment before typing back, "Thank you for everything. Good night, Christopher." As she got ready for bed, Jessica caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked the same as always, same dark skin, same intelligent eyes, same determined jawline. But something was different. Something in her expression, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held herself. She looked like a woman who was beginning to remember her own worth. And that realization was more intoxicating than any wine, more powerful than any revenge, more healing than any justice. For the first time since Malik's betrayal, Jessica Brooks was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to be happy. Meanwhile, across town, Christopher stood at the windows of his penthouse, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the woman who'd turned his carefully ordered world upside down in less than a week. He'd built his empire on calculated risks and strategic decisions, but nothing about his feelings for Jessica felt calculated. She was a risk worth taking, a mystery worth solving, a heart worth healing. And he was determined to prove himself worthy of her trust, no matter how long it took. Chapter 4. 2 weeks into what Jessica was carefully calling their professional friendship, she found herself looking forward to Christopher's daily text messages more than she cared to admit. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, coffee meetings that turned into long conversations, business lunches that somehow became personal confessions, evening calls that left her feeling understood in ways she'd forgotten were possible. But it was the small gestures that were slowly dismantling her defenses. The way he remembered she preferred her coffee with oat milk instead of regular cream. How he'd started sending her articles about business strategy that he thought might interest her. The fact that he always walked her to her car after their meetings, no matter how late the hour. Jessica was thinking about this as she prepared for their latest meeting, dinner at a small French bistro that Christopher claimed made the best coq au vin in the city. She'd chosen a deep burgundy dress that brought out the richness of her skin tone, paired with heels that added just enough height to make her feel confident. She was applying her lipstick when her phone rang. Dorothy's name flashed on the screen, and Jessica answered with a smile. "Let me guess," Dorothy said without preamble. "You're getting ready for another professional meeting with Mr. Wilson." "We're discussing potential collaboration opportunities," Jessica replied, though she could hear how unconvincing she sounded. "Right. And I'm sure the fact that you've been glowing like a woman in love for the past 2 weeks is purely coincidental." Jessica paused, her lipstick halfway to her mouth. "I'm not in love. Honey, I've known you for 20 years. I know what you look like when you're falling for someone. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The question haunted Jessica as she drove to the restaurant. What was she going to do about it? Christopher had been patient, respectful, moving at exactly the pace she'd requested. But the tension between them was building to a crescendo that couldn't be ignored much longer. Christopher was waiting for her at their table, standing as she approached with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that never failed to make her heart flutter. He looked devastating in a navy suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean frame. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made her skin tingle. "Thank you," she replied, accepting his kiss on her cheek. The brief contact sent electricity shooting through her nervous system. They ordered wine and settled into their familiar routine of conversation, but tonight felt different. There was an undercurrent of electricity, of anticipation, that made every casual touch feel loaded with meaning. "I have some news," Christopher said as their appetizers arrived. "Malik's been having some difficulty securing financing for his expansion plans." Jessica's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Difficulty how?" "Word tends to travel quickly in our industry," Christopher said carefully. "When questions arise about intellectual property practices, investors become cautious." Jessica felt a surge of satisfaction followed immediately by guilt. She'd wanted justice, but watching someone's empire crumble still felt harsh. "You're feeling guilty," Christopher observed, and Jessica realized her expression must have given her away. "A little," she admitted. "Is that wrong?" "It makes you human," Christopher said. "And it's one of the things I admire about you. You could have been vindictive, but even now, you're capable of empathy for someone who hurt you." The gentle observation made Jessica's chest tighten. Christopher had a way of seeing the best in her, even when she couldn't see it herself. "What about his employees?" she asked. "The people who work for him, they didn't steal anything." Christopher smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "I thought you might ask about that. I've already reached out to his key personnel. Several of them will be receiving job offers from my companies within the week." Jessica stared at him, stunned by his thoughtfulness. "You thought of everything." "I thought of you," he said simply. "I know you well enough to know you'd worry about innocent people getting caught in the crossfire." The casual intimacy of the statement, the implication that he knew her, understood her, anticipated her concerns, made Jessica's breath catch. When had someone last cared enough to consider her feelings so thoroughly? "Christopher," she began, but he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Dance with me," he said suddenly. Jessica glanced around the intimate restaurant. "There's no music." "There's always music," he said, standing and extending his hand. "You just have to know how to listen for it." Against her better judgment, Jessica allowed him to lead her to a small space near the windows. The restaurant was quiet except for the low murmur of conversation and the soft clink of cutlery against plates. Christopher pulled her into his arms, one hand settling at her waist while the other captured her fingers. They swayed together in perfect silence, and Jessica felt the last of her resistance crumbling. This close, she could smell his cologne, feel the solid warmth of his chest against her body, sense the controlled strength in his arms as he held her. "Jessica," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Yes," she whispered back. "I need you to know something." She pulled back enough to look at his face, and what she saw there made her heart stop. His gray eyes were dark with emotion, vulnerable in a way that made her feel trusted with something precious. "What?" she asked. "This isn't a game for me," he said quietly. "Whatever this is between us, it's not strategy or manipulation or a business transaction. It's real." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow because they voiced exactly what she'd been afraid to hope for. Real. Not calculated, not conditional, not temporary. Real. "For me too," she admitted, the words barely audible. Christopher's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He spun her gently, and when she came back into his arms, something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd been maintaining collapsed like a house of cards. They returned to their table, but neither of them could focus on food. The air between them crackled with electricity, with the promise of something that had been building for weeks. "Come home with me," Christopher said as they waited for the check, his voice rough with barely contained desire. Jessica's pulse jumped, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. This was the moment she'd been both dreading and anticipating, the point where careful friendship would either evolve into something deeper or shatter under the weight of expectation. "Christopher," she started. "Just to talk," he said quickly, though the heat in his eyes suggested talking was only the beginning of what he wanted. "I have something I want to show you." Jessica knew she should say no. Should maintain the careful boundaries they'd established, should protect her heart from the possibility of another devastating betrayal. But as she looked at this man who'd fought for her justice, who'd seen her strength when she felt broken, who'd waited patiently for her to trust him, she realized she was tired of being afraid. "Okay," she said, and watched desire flare in his eyes like a lit match. The drive to Christopher's penthouse was torture, 20 minutes of loaded silence and stolen glances that made Jessica's skin burn with anticipation. By the time they reached his apartment, her nerves were wound so tight she thought she might snap. Christopher's home was a study in masculine elegance, rich leather furniture, warm wood tones, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city sprawling below like a carpet of stars. But Jessica barely noticed the decor because all her attention was focused on the man standing beside her. "What did you want to show me?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Christopher walked to his desk and picked up a thick folder. "This," he said, handing it to her. Jessica opened the folder and felt her breath catch. Inside were architectural plans for a new business complex, and prominently featured was a space labeled Brooks Strategic Consulting, Executive Offices. "I don't understand," she said, looking up at him. "I'm developing a new commercial complex downtown," Christopher explained. "High-end office space for innovative companies. I want you to be one of the anchor tenants." Jessica flipped through the plans, seeing her company's name prominently displayed, noting the generous square footage and prime location. It was more than generous, it was a gift that would transform her rebuilding business into something truly spectacular. "Christopher, I can't accept this," she said, though every business instinct she had was screaming at her to take the opportunity. "Why not?" "Because it's too much. Because it feels like charity. Because..." She struggled to find the words. "Because you're afraid it comes with strings attached," Christopher finished gently. Jessica nodded, hating how vulnerable the admission made her feel. Christopher stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "The only string attached is that I want to see you succeed. I want to see you build the empire you deserve." "Why?" she whispered. "Because you're extraordinary," he said simply. "And extraordinary people deserve extraordinary opportunities." The sincerity in his voice broke something loose in Jessica's chest. Here was a man who wanted to lift her up rather than tear her down, who saw her potential rather than her weaknesses, who fought for her dreams instead of stealing them. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say you'll consider it," Christopher said. "Say you'll stop punishing yourself for someone else's betrayal." The gentle rebuke hit its target, and Jessica felt tears prick the back of her eyes. She had been punishing herself, hadn't she? Refusing to trust, refusing to hope, refusing to believe she deserved good things. "Christopher," she began, but he stepped even closer, and suddenly they were standing so close she could count his eyelashes. "Jessica," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I need you to know how incredible you are. How brilliant, how beautiful, how worthy of every good thing life has to offer." The words were like a balm to wounds she'd carried for so long they'd become part of her identity. Jessica felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by the warmth in his voice and the promise in his eyes. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, his hands coming up to frame her face. "But you don't have to be scared alone anymore." The tender promise was her undoing. Jessica closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, then increasingly desperate as months of denied attraction finally found its outlet. Christopher kissed her back with a passion that stole her breath, his arms coming around her waist to pull her closer. Jessica melted into him, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his larger frame, how right it felt to be held by someone who saw her worth. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jessica's lipstick was smudged, and Christopher's hair was mussed where her fingers had run through it. "That was..." Jessica started. "Long overdue," Christopher finished with a smile that made her heart race. Jessica laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes, it was." They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, about their hopes and fears and dreams. Jessica found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, and Christopher listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like the most important person in the world. As the night grew late, Jessica knew she should go home. But she also knew that leaving would mean returning to her empty apartment and her careful walls, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Stay, Christopher said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Christopher. Just to sleep, he said, though the desire in his eyes suggested he wanted much more. I'm not ready to let you go yet. Jessica looked at this man who'd become so important to her so quickly, and realized she wasn't ready to leave either. Okay, she said for the second time that evening, and watched his face light up with joy. What does it mean to truly trust someone after betrayal? Sometimes healing happens not when we're ready, but when we meet someone worth the risk. Have you ever had to choose between safety and love? Share your thoughts below. We're all learning how to open our hearts again. As Christopher led her to his guest room and provided her with one of his shirts to sleep in, Jessica realized she'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed. She was falling for Christopher Wilson, had already fallen, if she was being honest with herself. And for the first time since Malik's betrayal, that didn't terrify her. It thrilled her. Because Christopher wasn't Malik. He'd proven that in a dozen different ways, through actions that spoke louder than any words could. He was worthy of her trust, worthy of her heart, worthy of the risk she was taking. As she settled into the impossibly soft sheets of his guest bed, wearing his shirt that smelled like him, Jessica allowed herself to imagine a future where she didn't have to choose between love and safety. A future where she could have both. It was a dangerous dream, but as she drifted off to sleep in Christopher's home, surrounded by his warmth and protection, Jessica decided that some dreams were worth the danger. Because some people were worth fighting for. And Christopher Wilson was definitely worth fighting for. Chapter 5. Jessica woke up in Christopher's guest bed to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, the kiss, the vulnerability, the decision to stay. She reached for her phone and felt her blood turn to ice when she saw 15 missed calls from Dorothy and a string of increasingly frantic text messages. Call me immediately. Jess, this is urgent. Malik's made a move. Call me now. Jessica's hands shook as she dialed Dorothy's number. Her friend answered on the first ring. Finally, Dorothy said, her voice tight with stress. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours. I'm at Christopher's, Jessica said, then immediately felt foolish for the admission. What's wrong? What's Malik done? He's filed a countersuit, Dorothy said grimly. He's claiming that you stole the intellectual property from him, not the other way around. And Jess, he's got documentation that looks legitimate. Jessica felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. That's impossible. I have timestamps, emails, development records, so does he, Dorothy interrupted. And his are dated 6 months before yours. The room spun around Jessica as the implications sank in. He's falsified evidence. Obviously. But it's good falsification. Professional grade. This isn't something he threw together overnight, he's been planning this for a while. Jessica sank onto the edge of the bed, her mind racing. What does this mean? It means we're in for a long, expensive legal battle, Dorothy said. And it means your reputation is about to be dragged through the mud while we fight it. Malik's already reached out to several industry publications with his side of the story. Oh God, Jessica whispered. All her work, all her rebuilding, all her careful reconstruction of her professional life, it could all be destroyed by morning. There was a soft knock on the guest room door, and Christopher's voice called, Jessica? Is everything all right? I have to go, Jessica told Dorothy. I'll be at your office in an hour. She hung up and opened the door to find Christopher standing in the hallway, fully dressed in a charcoal suit, holding a steaming cup of coffee. His expression shifted from concern to alarm when he saw her face. What's wrong? He asked immediately. Jessica took the coffee with shaking hands and told him everything. With each word, Christopher's expression grew darker, more dangerous. When she finished, He was silent for a long moment. "He's falsified evidence," Christopher said finally, his voice controlled but deadly quiet. "Yes, but proving that will take months, maybe years. And in the meantime..." Jessica's voice broke. "Christopher, this could destroy everything I've worked for." Christopher set down his own coffee and pulled her into his arms. Jessica melted into his embrace, drawing strength from his solid presence. "It won't," he said firmly. "I won't let it." "You can't fix this," Jessica said against his chest. "This isn't your fight." Christopher pulled back enough to look at her, his gray eyes fierce. "Like hell it isn't. Someone is attacking the woman I..." He stopped, swallowed hard, then continued. "Someone is attacking you. That makes it my fight." Jessica's heart stuttered at what he'd almost said, but there was no time to process it. She needed to get to Dorothy's office, needed to start damage control, needed to figure out how to survive this latest assault on her carefully rebuilt life. "I need to go," she said reluctantly. "I'm coming with you," Christopher said. "Christopher, no. This is my mess, this is our mess," he interrupted. "And we're going to handle it together." The drive to Dorothy's office was tense and silent. Jessica's mind raced through worst-case scenarios while Christopher made a series of phone calls that she couldn't quite follow. She caught fragments, something about forensic accountants and document analysis and media relations. Dorothy's law office was a flurry of activity when they arrived. Junior associates hurried between offices carrying files, phones rang constantly, and Dorothy herself looked like she'd been up all night. "This is bad," Dorothy said without preamble when Jessica and Christopher entered her office. "Malik's been busy. He's got affidavits from former employees claiming they witnessed him developing the software. He's got emails that appear to show you asking him for help with coding problems. He's even got financial records showing payments to outside developers." Jessica felt sick. "It's all fabricated." "Of course it is," Dorothy said. "But it's very good fabrication. Whoever helped him with this knew what they were doing." "How long do we have?" Christopher asked, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. Dorothy looked at him with surprise, as if she'd forgotten he was there. "To respond to the filing? 30 days. But the damage to Jessica's reputation is happening now. I've already had 3 reporters call asking for comment." "Don't talk to the media," Christopher said immediately. "Not yet. With respect, Mr. Wilson," Dorothy said carefully, "this isn't your area of expertise." "Actually, it is," Christopher responded. "I've dealt with corporate reputation management before. The key is controlling the narrative from the beginning." Jessica looked between her best friend and the man she was falling in love with, feeling like a spectator in her own crisis. "What do you suggest?" "We go on the offensive," Christopher said. "We don't wait for Malik to control the story. We tell our own story first." "How?" Jessica asked. Christopher's smile was sharp as a blade. "We use every resource at our disposal. I know people, Jessica. Journalists, investigators, tech experts who can analyze documents and prove they've been tampered with. We don't just defend against his lies, we expose them." Hope flickered in Jessica's chest for the first time since Dorothy's phone call. "You think it will work?" "I think Malik Brown made a crucial mistake," Christopher said. "He underestimated who he was dealing with. He thought you were alone, defenseless. He didn't count on you having someone willing to fight for you." The fierce protectiveness in Christopher's voice made Jessica's heart clench. Here was a man who was willing to use his resources, his connections, his reputation to defend her. The gesture was so generous, so unexpected, that it left her speechless. But it also terrified her. Because accepting Christopher's help would mean owing him a debt she might never be able to repay. It would mean becoming dependent on someone again, trusting someone with her future. I need to think about this, Jessica said quietly. Christopher's expression softened. Of course. But while you're thinking, let me make some calls. Information gathering isn't a commitment, it's just smart strategy. Over the next several hours, Christopher's network sprang into action with frightening efficiency. Within 3 hours, they had preliminary findings from a forensic document analysis that showed clear signs of tampering in Malik's evidence. By evening, they had statements from 2 former employees who admitted to being pressured into signing false affidavits. How did you do this so quickly? Jessica asked as they reviewed the evidence in Dorothy's conference room. I told you, I know people, Christopher said simply. And when someone I care about is being attacked, I use every advantage I have. The casual admission of caring hit Jessica like a physical blow. She looked at this man who was dismantling her enemy's lies with surgical precision, who was using his considerable power to protect her, and felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just attraction anymore. This wasn't just gratitude or admiration or even love. This was recognition, the bone-deep understanding that Christopher Wilson was her partner in every sense of the word. Someone who would fight beside her, not for her. Someone who saw her as an equal worth defending. Christopher, she said softly. He looked up from the documents he'd been studying, and their eyes met across the conference table. The connection that sparked between them was electric, charged with possibility and promise. Yes? Thank you, she said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything she couldn't yet say. His smile was gentle, understanding. You don't need to thank me, Jessica. This is what people do for each other when they... He paused, swallowed hard. When they care about each other. Dorothy cleared her throat loudly, breaking the spell. As touching as this is, we still have work to do. Malik's not going to give up easily, and we need to be prepared for his next move. She was right, of course. But as Jessica turned her attention back to the legal strategy, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that she wasn't fighting alone. That she had someone in her corner who would stay there, no matter how difficult the battle became. It was a feeling worth fighting for. Late that night, Jessica sat in her apartment, staring at the city lights beyond her windows. The day had been a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and strategic planning, but now, in the quiet of her own space, she finally had time to process what had happened. Malik had tried to destroy her again. But this time, she hadn't faced his attack alone. This time, she'd had Christopher beside her, using his resources and connections to defend her with a fierce protectiveness that left her breathless. Her phone buzzed with a text from Christopher. How are you holding up? Jessica stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, better than I expected. Thank you for today. You don't need to thank me. We're in this together now. The simple statement made Jessica's eyes burn with unshed tears. Together. When was the last time someone had chosen to stand with her instead of against her? Christopher, what you did today, what you're doing for me, it's more than I could have asked for. It's what you deserve, Jessica. Someone who fights for you, protects you, sees your worth. You deserve all of that and more. Jessica set her phone aside and walked to her bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her was the same one who'd been destroyed by Malik's betrayal 2 years ago, the same one who'd spent months rebuilding herself from nothing. But there was something different in her eyes now, a light that hadn't been there before. She looked like a woman who was learning to believe in her own worth again. A woman who was discovering that not all men were like Malik Brown. A woman who was brave enough to open her heart to love, even knowing the risks. Jessica Brooks was falling in love with Christopher Wilson, and for the first time in years, that didn't scare her. It empowered her. Because tomorrow, she would wake up knowing that someone believed in her enough to fight for her. Someone saw her as worth protecting, worth defending, worth loving. And with that knowledge came a strength she'd forgotten she possessed, the strength to fight not just for justice, but for happiness. Not just for survival, but for love. Malik Brown had made his move, but Jessica was no longer the broken woman he'd left behind. She was something much more dangerous, a woman in love, with a man powerful enough to help her win. The real battle was just beginning. Chapter 6. 3 weeks later, Jessica stood in the conference room where her journey with Christopher had begun, but this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. Malik sat across from her, his lawyer beside him, both looking like men who knew they were about to lose everything. Christopher's forensic team had been thorough. The falsified documents had been exposed with scientific precision, the coerced witnesses had recanted their statements, and most damaging of all, they'd found the digital trail showing exactly when and how Malik had created his fake evidence. "Mr. Brown," Dorothy said, her voice crisp with professional satisfaction, "in light of the evidence we've presented, I think it's time we discussed settlement terms." Malik's face was ashen. The charming, confident man who'd once stolen Jessica's work and her heart looked like a shadow of himself. "This is all circumstantial," he said weakly. "Digital forensics, witness recantations, and expert testimony are hardly circumstantial," Christopher said calmly. He hadn't taken his eyes off Malik since they'd entered the room, and his presence radiated controlled menace. "You falsified evidence, suborned perjury, and attempted to destroy Ms. Brooks' reputation. That's not just civil liability, that's criminal conduct." Jessica watched Malik crumble under Christopher's steady gaze and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no sense of triumph. Just a profound emptiness where her anger used to live. "What do you want?" Malik asked quietly, his voice defeated. Jessica looked at this man who'd once meant everything to her, who'd promised her forever and then stolen her dreams, and realized that she didn't want anything from him anymore. The revenge she'd planned for 2 years suddenly felt hollow, meaningless. "I want my intellectual property rights formally transferred back to me," she said finally. "I want a public statement acknowledging the theft and clearing my reputation. And I want you to stay away from me." "That's it?" Malik asked, surprise flickering in his eyes. Jessica felt Christopher's hand squeeze hers under the table, offering silent support. "That's it," she confirmed. "I don't want your money or your business. I just want what was always mine." 2 hours later, the papers were signed and Malik was gone from her life forever. Jessica walked out of that conference room feeling lighter than she had in years, as if she'd finally set down a burden she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "How do you feel?" Christopher asked as they stood on the sidewalk outside the building. Jessica looked up at the man who'd fought beside her, who'd used his power to protect her rather than control her, who'd shown her what it meant to be truly valued. "Free," she said simply. Christopher's smile was radiant. "Good. Because I have something I want to ask you." Before Jessica could respond, he was down on one knee in the middle of the busy sidewalk, pulling a ring box from his jacket pocket. Jessica's hands flew to her mouth as passers-by stopped to watch, phones appearing to capture the moment. "Jessica Brooks," Christopher said, his voice carrying clearly over the street noise, 2 months ago, you walked into my life and turned everything upside down. You showed me what real strength looks like, what genuine courage means, what it feels like to meet someone worth fighting for." Jessica felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she couldn't look away from Christopher's face, from the love and certainty shining in his gray eyes. "You rebuilt yourself from ashes and came back stronger than before," he continued. "You faced down your betrayer with dignity and grace. You taught me that some people are worth every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of uncertainty." He opened the ring box to reveal a stunning solitaire diamond that caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows across the sidewalk. "I love you, Jessica. I love your brilliant mind and your fierce heart and your incredible strength. I love the way you see the world and the way you make me want to be better than I am. Will you marry me?" Jessica looked down at this extraordinary man who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to love her anyway, who'd fought for her justice and her happiness with equal determination, who'd shown her that not all love came with conditions and betrayals. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Christopher. Yes, yes, yes." The crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers as Christopher slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her. Jessica melted into his arms, tasting salt from her own tears, feeling like her heart might burst from the sheer joy of it all. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing and crying at the same time. "I love you too," Jessica said against his lips. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good," Christopher murmured, holding her close. "Love should be a little terrifying. It means it matters." They spent the rest of the afternoon celebrating, first with champagne at the restaurant where they'd had their first real conversation, then with phone calls to Dorothy and Jerome and Harrison, all of whom claimed they'd seen this coming from the beginning. As evening fell, they found themselves back in Christopher's penthouse, standing at the windows that overlooked the city where they'd both built their empires. Jessica wore Christopher's ring on her finger and his love in her heart, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt completely, utterly whole. "I have something for you," Christopher said, producing an envelope from his desk. Jessica opened it to find the deed to the office space he'd shown her weeks ago, but now it was in her name, a wedding gift that would allow her to build the consulting empire she'd always dreamed of. "Christopher, this is too much," she protested. "It's not enough," he said seriously. "You deserve an empire, Jessica. You deserve everything good this world has to offer." Jessica looked at the deed, then at the man who'd given it to her, and realized that he'd given her something much more valuable than real estate or business opportunities. He'd given her back her belief in her own worth. "I spent 2 years thinking I needed revenge to feel whole again," she said quietly. "But what I really needed was someone who could see my value when I'd forgotten it myself." Christopher cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away fresh tears. "You never forgot your value, Jessica. You just needed someone to remind you that you were worth fighting for." They made love that night with a passion that was tender and fierce in equal measure. Christopher worshipped her body with the same reverence he'd shown her mind, making her feel beautiful and desired and absolutely precious. Jessica gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, trusting him with her heart and her body and her future. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in his bed, Jessica's head on Christopher's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted in the darkness. "After Malik, I thought I was broken. Too damaged to trust anyone again." "You were never broken," Christopher said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "You were wounded, but wounds heal. And sometimes they make us stronger in the broken places." Jessica lifted her head to look at him. "How did you know? How did you know I was worth the risk?" Christopher's smile was soft in the moonlight streaming through the windows. "Because you fought for yourself when no one else would. Because you rebuilt your life from nothing and refused to let anyone define your worth. Because you looked at me and saw a man, not a bank account. And because," he continued, pulling her up for a gentle kiss, "you made me believe in love again too." 6 months later, Jessica and Christopher were married in an intimate ceremony overlooking the ocean. Dorothy was her maid of honor, Jerome walked her down the aisle, and Harrison stood beside Christopher as his best man. The guest list was small but meaningful, people who'd supported them through their journey to love. As they exchanged vows, Jessica thought about the woman she'd been when she first walked into that conference room, burning with anger and thirst for revenge. That woman had been strong, but she'd been brittle too, hardened by betrayal and disappointment. The woman standing at this altar was different. She was still strong, but now her strength came from love rather than anger, from hope rather than hatred. She'd learned that true power wasn't about destroying your enemies, it was about building something beautiful with someone who saw your worth. "I, Jessica, take you, Christopher," she said, her voice clear and strong, "to be my husband, my partner, my greatest adventure. I promise to trust you with my heart, to build dreams with you, to choose love over fear every single day." Christopher's vows were equally heartfelt, promising to protect her dreams, celebrate her successes, and love her through every challenge life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Christopher kissed her as the sun set over the Pacific, Jessica felt the last piece of her broken heart slide into place. She'd thought her story was about revenge, but it had really been about redemption. Not just reclaiming what Malik had stolen, but reclaiming her ability to love and trust and hope. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Christopher whispered in her ear, "No regrets?" Jessica looked into the eyes of the man who'd seen her strength when she felt weak, who'd fought for her justice and her happiness, who'd chosen to love her with all her scars and shadows. "Only one," she said with a smile. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to realize I deserved this," she said. "Deserved you. Deserved love without conditions or betrayals." Christopher spun her gently, and when she came back into his arms, his expression was serious. "Promise me something, Mrs. Wilson. Anything. Promise me you'll never forget your worth again. Promise me you'll remember that you're extraordinary, with or without me." Jessica felt tears prick her eyes at the generous love in his voice. Even now, even after she'd committed her life to him, he was more concerned with her happiness than his own security. "I promise," she whispered. "And I promise to remind you of yours too." They swayed together as the stars appeared overhead, two people who'd found in each other not just love, but the reflection of their own worth. Jessica had learned that revenge was cold comfort compared to the warmth of being truly known and valued. She'd discovered that the best way to defeat those who'd hurt her wasn't to destroy them, but to build something beautiful in spite of them. Sometimes the greatest revenge is living so well that your past can't touch your future. When we choose love over anger, hope over fear, we don't just heal ourselves, we become unstoppable. Have you ever discovered your worth through someone else's eyes? Share your story of finding love after betrayal in the comments below. Your journey matters, and this community is here to celebrate every victory with you. As the music played and the ocean whispered against the shore, Jessica Brooks Wilson danced with her husband and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. She'd set out to reclaim what was stolen from her and ended up discovering something far more valuable, a love that saw her clearly, valued her completely, and chose her absolutely. The girl who'd been broken by betrayal was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who'd chosen love over revenge, who'd built an empire not on the ruins of her enemies but on the foundation of her own incredible strength. And as Christopher held her close under the starlit sky, Jessica knew that this was just the beginning. They had a lifetime of adventures ahead, a consulting empire to build together, and love stories to create that would inspire others to believe in second chances. The revenge she'd planned had given her justice. But the love she'd found had given her something infinitely more precious, a future bright with possibility and a heart finally, completely whole. Some endings are really just beginnings in disguise. And as Jessica danced with the love of her life, she knew that her greatest adventure was just getting started. The best revenge, she'd learned, wasn't destroying those who'd hurt her. It was living so fully, loving so completely, and succeeding so magnificently that their betrayal became nothing more than a stepping stone to her happiness. And she'd never felt more powerful, more valued, or more loved than she did in this moment, dancing under the stars with the man who'd helped her remember who she really was. Tomorrow brings a new story to our Dear Love Diaries family, another journey of hearts finding their way to love. Until then, remember that your worth isn't determined by those who've hurt you, but by your courage to keep loving despite the pain. You are extraordinary, you are valuable, and you deserve a love that sees and celebrates every beautiful part of who you are. Make sure to like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe to join our growing family of love story believers, and tell us in the comments, what moment in Jessica and Christopher's journey resonated most with you. Your engagement helps us bring more stories of hope and healing to hearts that need them.